10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
He says, I want men who ain't afraid to kill, I want men who ain't afraid to die, and I want men who can walk 50 miles, and I raised my hand.
I didn't know what in the world had happened. I thought maybe the Germans had zeroed in on us with an anti-tank gun or something like that. I went up in the air like this, hit the ground running. Well, as I was running, I recall, well, this arm is still there, this arm is there, the legs are there. I must be in pretty good shape.
A piercing bullet went through my helmet and shot a hole in the front of my helmet and ricocheted around the top and rolled the steel up in the back, made a pretty good sized hole in the back.
Because they were so thin, they couldn't lie in any spot without their bones piercing their skin.
And the final one kind of woke up. And he swung around, he got the German. I saw 4 fighter planes go down in the space of a little over a minute.
When the tide came in, we got underway again, only to have the boat sink under us.
Over the years, I've thought that as terrible as that was to see, that I was glad that I saw it, and I knew that it had happened.
One happy guy. We really celebrated that one when they said the war was over.
I'm proud of what I did, because I gave it my last ounce of energy.
And now another episode of World War II, The Personal Stories.
Hello and welcome to another edition of World War II, The Personal Stories. I'm your host, Dave Smith. Today's show will feature a discussion of a very personal understanding of life and death in the Royal Canadian Air Force during World War II. The book I'm holding is called They Shall Grow Not Old. It's a short biography of each of the 18,000 or so men killed in the RCAF during World War II. Today's show will deal with one of those people, Mr. Stan Wick, who was killed in a bombing mission on March 24th, 1944, over Germany. Our guest today is Stan Wick's nephew, Stan Turner, who many of you are familiar with from years of broadcasting with Hubbard Communications and currently with CONUS Communications.
That's right.
Welcome to the show, Stan. I appreciate you coming.
Thank you very much, David. It's great to be here.
Stan, you spent the better part of 25 years researching your uncle's life and death. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can start by giving us a recount of what's motivated you to spend that period of time actually finding out this information?
It's fun to talk about it, David. We hear a lot of, so many of our friends and neighbors do some genealogical research, finding out who they are, where they came from, who their relatives were. I've always wondered this too, in the general sense of my mother's parents and my father's parents, where did they come from? But since I was named after Stan Wick, this uncle of mine, who was killed before I was born, I naturally wanted to know who he was, what he was all about. As a kid, I remember going through the scrapbooks my mother had put together, just going through and seeing photos of this rather handsome young man, the great smile, great teeth, looking very proud, not arrogant, but very proud, and in some cases standing in front of aircraft, and it all looked very romantic and glamorous. And then as I paged through the scrapbook, the tragedy of his early death. But you know, in the telling and retelling of stories within a family, you get some of the truth and you get fiction. You get some stories, some myths, some legends that don't bear up under scrutiny. And as I started delving into this, I saw that some of what I was told by my grandparents and my mother was true, and others weren't quite squaring with the facts. So I thought I should set out and try and set the record straight, and on behalf of the whole family, find out what happened to this man, Stan Wick, part of our family. What happened to him during that period of his life, his sadly short life, that nobody could know about because of the wartime censorship and all the rest. So there were many blank pages in his story, and I tried to set out to fill in some of those blanks.
What's been some of the research that you've done? I understand that you've actually gone back and visited with some of the people that your uncle was in service with, and actually found an old girlfriend.
That's true.
How did you uncover all of this information?
Dave, there are no how-to-do-it manuals when it comes to digging out this sort of thing, so I kind of made it up as I went along, and I enjoyed the help from people, countless people. I could never have thought in my wildest dreams that A, I could find, and B, would be willing to help me. But scores of people, well over 100, have done this. When you set out to do something like this, you want to find the people who knew the subject of your research. A lot of them are still alive. You have to find them. You have to go through old letters and documents. So first of all, I'd set out to find the 3 survivors of my uncle's 7-man bomber crew. They were shot down after bombing Berlin on the date you mentioned in March 1944. Are they still alive? If so, where might they be? I knew that 2 of them were Canadian, 1 was an Englishman. I found the 2 Canadians right away. I knew that 1 came from Toronto, the other from Montreal. I simply called directory assistants, and they were there. That was a piece of cake. And this was an omen because, gee, that was easy. I better keep going with this. What about the Englishman? I knew he came from the Durham area of northern England. That's all I knew. That was from a 1944 letter. I had an address where he grew up, but letters to that little town gave me nothing. What do you do? Well, I went to the Minneapolis Library and looked up all the names in Durham with the surname, all the listings under the surname Bostad. His name was Stan Bostad actually. And there were about 25 of them, David. That's not going to do me any good. Who are these people? So I wrote a letter to each and every one of them. I just Xeroxed 20-some letters and sent them to all of them. Bingo, I found a cousin who said he's living in Bristol today. And so he said, I've told him of your search, and lo and behold, about 2 weeks later, I had a letter from Bristol from Stan Bostad, one of my uncle's crewmen. Bingo, I had found the 3 survivors. That was the key. It told me that it was possible to find out what happened. Here I had the 3 members of his crew who could tell me what happened during that dark period where we knew nothing really about what happened. So, and then setting out to find the other people, the other players in the game, other squadron members. I found the commanding officer of the squadron. David, a commanding officer of a bomber squadron in the Royal Air Force Bomber Command during the war oversaw 700 people, flying personnel, non-flying personnel. This commanding officer was 23 years old at the time, in charge of 700 people. These were kids we're talking about. The CO was 23. Most of the flyers were 19, 20, 21 years of age.
Well, you had mentioned to me in a previous conversation about this, about that whole generation of individuals who fought in the war. And that really this was, in some ways, a lost generation, that there was a lot of idealism when they set off as young men to go to war, but that changed over time, and I think that you've found that that was the case in your uncle's.
There was a definite evolution. There was a definite progression from, well, imagine, for example, my uncle grew up in a small Saskatchewan prairie town, a town that was built in the middle of wheat fields, basically. That was the main industry, was wheat farming. And I should explain maybe at the outset here, I am an American citizen. My mother is an American citizen. She is one of 8 children born of Norwegian immigrants who settled in Montevideo, Minnesota after the turn of the century. 4 of the 8 children, including my mother, were born in Montevideo. And then around 1913 or so, my grandfather, their father and mother, moved to Saskatchewan because that's where the work was. My grandfather was a builder, a contractor. And these little towns on the prairie needed somebody to build them, literally. So the 4 other siblings who were born there were Canadians. So the family is split right down the middle.
American and Canadian.
American and Canadian. 4 American, 4 Canadian. That being as it may, I just wanted to establish that right away, why an American, why we're talking about an uncle who's a Canadian. But yes, he grew up in this, the whole family grew up in this very small town, and their horizons were so limited. To see an airplane come over in the 1920s and 30s was a huge event. They saw pictures of them in Life magazine, but to see one come over was really something. So I think the seed of my uncle's interest in flying was this unimaginable dream of flying. He knew he never could do it because the family didn't have the resources. I think the notion of even going to college after high school was just impossible. Along came the war, and aha, a chance to volunteer and get into the Air Force. get out of the small town, get into something that, gee, it seems glamorous and romantic. If you could make the cut, if you qualified, there's no telling what you could do. Mind you, these kids were reading stories of the Battle of Britain pilots at the time, fighting this great noble fight against the enemy, the Hitler's Third Reich.
How old was he when he went into the Air Force?
He was 18 years old. He was right out of high school, just graduated from 12th grade, and went up to a town in Saskatchewan called Saskatoon, where my two other uncles live today, and enlisted in the RCAF. They said, thanks, kid. We'll take all your measurements and your numbers, go back home, we'll let you know if we can use you. And a couple months later, he got the call. Went to Alberta for his flying training.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the training there. It was a very dangerous thing to be in training as well as in war.
It was.
Can you describe some of the things that you discovered there? I understand you've got some letters actually from his training days. Why don't you share some of that with us?
We get the flavor of them, and by now we've seen a picture of them, so you can see how young they all were. The training was extremely dangerous, but there was adventure along with it too. I might just read a couple of things for you, just to give you some of the flavor of what the training was like. You first went to boot camp, and then you went to ground school. In ground school, he says, I'm back in Edmonton, Alberta once more. I'm going to the initial training school here, just put in my first day, and am I ever tired? We didn't go to bed until 1 this morning and had to be up by 6 a.m., so no wonder why I'm tired. There's a Canadian expression for you, It certainly is a nice place here, about 1,000% better than at Penhold, Alberta. Living quarters are just swell, the food is wonderful. Was up at 6 a.m., have to be all polished up, and for breakfast at 6:30. Have to be in the drill hall by 7:20, work till 11:50, have an hour off for dinner, that's what we call lunch, then about an hour more drill. Pretty tough, or at least I think it is. They work these kids literally till 1 in the morning, up at 6 a.m. and go, go, go.
There were thousands of them in this?
Thousands of them. In this case, in Edmonton, the Air Force had taken over the Edmonton University, so they were billeted in dormitory rooms there, and they had instructors there in ground school. It's very tough. The Royal Canadian Air Force became what was called the Airdrome of Democracy. They were the training school for the world. A lot of Americans, you should know, came up and trained before Pearl Harbor, trained with the Royal Canadian Air Force to get into the war.
So it was actually a multinational type of situation.
It was. Every country represented in the British Empire, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, Britain itself, and of course Canadians from all over the country were going into, they had 104 flying schools in Canada between 1939 and 45. By the end of the war, Dave, to give you an idea how big this operation was, this training, this aircrew training machine is what it was, they turned out 131,000 aircrew, about 50,000 of whom were pilots. So Roosevelt, FDR called America the arsenal of democracy. Canada was the airdrome of democracy.
All right, so how long was he in training then, and what were some of the other experiences he had there?
He was in training from October 1941 until Wings Day, when he got his pilot's wings in November of 1942. And the shot that we've seen here, where he's smiling all aglow with the pilot's wings on his breast, is November 19th, 1942. That was the proudest day, I think, of his life. He was at that point 19 years old, had made the grade.
What was his rank at that point?
His rank at that point, he became a sergeant. Now, in our Air Force, in the American Air Force, pilots were commissioned right away. They became officers, second lieutenant. Not in the Commonwealth Air Forces. The top third of the class became officers. The other 2/3 became sergeants. Okay. And he stayed a sergeant until 9 days before he was killed. That's how slow the promotions were in the British Air Force, and Canada was part of the British Air Force.
Now, he was in the bomber division?
During the course of their training, the instructors would take a look at these guys, and they first started training on these little biplanes, look like World War I planes, called Tiger Moths. Little, flimsy little things, but great trainers. At that point, the instructor would look at the guy, the individual student, and say, is he kind of a free spirit, or does he seem like a team player? The free spirits became the fighter pilots. Some of them became instructors, but most of them became fighter pilots. But the bomber offensive against Germany was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and so most of these guys, by the time my uncle was going through in 1942 in his training, were destined for the bomber squadrons because their losses were becoming horrific. They needed to funnel in replacement flyers. So he ultimately, on Wings Day, he volunteered to go to bombers overseas, which was, in a sense, a death sentence right there, because the loss rate was so high at that point that the chances of coming back were not very good. But again, he could not foresee in great detail the horror of what he was getting into.
Well, there was an interesting statistic that you mentioned, that the actual losses of the Bomber Corps were quite high during World War II.
The Royal Canadian Air Force, as you have noted, lost more than 18,000 men in World War II. That's huge for a country that numbered only 10 million people during the war. But I have a couple of numbers, and I'm not going to flood you with numbers here, but this is interesting. In just the bomber group, the Canadian bomber group in World War II, of which he was a part, 814 aircraft failed to return. They were shot down. 814, 75% of the men on those planes were killed. 3/4 were killed. Only the German U-boat crews had a greater proportional loss of their men than Royal Air Force Bomber Command did.
And as you say, going into this, they had no clue that this was going to
They had a clue, Dave. They had a clue that there were a lot of losses over there, but I've talked to so many of the veterans, those few who survived, who told me, I said, how did you deal with this? You knew it was dangerous. You knew it was life-threatening. You knew you might come back. He said, yeah, there were going to be fatalities, but it would be the other guy, not me. And you talked about phases before. At first, the phase was, it can't be me. Once you got near the action or started to get into it, you thought, well, maybe it will be me, or it could be me. Toward the end, a lot of them said, it's going to be me. That is, killed.
Well, let's take him from the training now to Britain. He went to England to serve. When was this, and what was going on in the war at that time?
Good point. This was in December of 1942, so it was just a couple of weeks after he got his pilot's wings, became a pilot, and they shipped them over right away. Didn't even have enough time in his leave to come down here to St. Louis Park and see my mother, his sister, and the family. So he went over right away. Went over on the Queen Elizabeth, the original Queen Elizabeth, the big one. 15,000 souls were on that particular voyage. The Queen Mary and Elizabeth were used as troop carriers then, and they moved so fast that there were no escort ships with them. This point of the war is a very good point you ask about, because the German U-boat, the submarine war, was taking a horrendous toll of Allied shipping. Hitler told his U-boat commanders that if they sunk either the Queen Elizabeth or the Queen Mary, they would get, I think, the equivalent of $1 million in German money. A month before my uncle sailed on the Queen Elizabeth from Halifax, Nova Scotia to Scotland, a German U-boat commander had the Queen Elizabeth in his periscope sights and fired off 3 torpedoes and missed.
How are you able to find that?
Well, that's a matter of record.
Is it?
As a matter of fact, the U-boat captain has written about that.
Is that right?
They weren't sure at first that it was the Queen Elizabeth, but after a while, when they missed and surfaced and saw the wake and and they had some aerial reconnaissance, that was the Queen Elizabeth. But as I say, those big ships moved so fast, they outran escorts, and they could usually outrun the U-boats. But that's how close it could come. Sure. This captain almost sunk, or hit at least, the Queen Elizabeth. And imagine the loss of human life.
Oh,
15,000 souls down.
So he got to
England, and right away, the Canadian airmen were sent, after they landed at Scotland, landed on the boat, were sent by troop train down to Bournemouth on the English Channel. This was a gigantic holding tank for the Canadian airmen. They were processed there, got their photos taken, got their flying gear, and they waited and waited until they were posted into another round of training. Okay, they learned how to fly in Canada, but the weather in Canada is pretty good. You get to England, you have to learn all over again how to fly in what the British call the clag, the fog, the smog, the overcast, the constant rain. So they had to relearn how to fly blind on instruments. That was another long process. In Stan Wick's case, it went from March 1943. He finally got posted. He went back flying Tiger Moths again after he had learned to fly 2-engine aircraft in Canada. And then eventually, in July of 1943, he was crewed up. His crew was formed. This was done this way. They were going to fly Wellington twin-engine bombers, which were now used for operational training. This was the last phase before you got into the shooting war. What they did was they took an equivalent number of pilots and navigators and bomb aimers and gunners and threw them all together in a big hangar and said, okay, gentlemen, sort yourself out into crews. So they'd all go looking around. Okay, they didn't know each other. There's a navigator over there. If I'm a pilot, I'm looking for a navigator. I've got to find a gunner. I've got to find a bomb aimer, what we call a bombardier. And it was just this happenstance kind of routine.
What was the purpose of that?
It worked. The purpose was, how could you assign men to a crew? Better to let them just on their own intuition pick out each other. You went by the looks of a guy. I said, look at this Dave Smith guy. He's got pilot's wings. He looks like a good guy. I think I'll ask if I'm a navigator. Can I join you? And that's how it was done.
Now, did he stay with that crew then
He did.
throughout his entire...
He stayed with those same 4 other guys. Then, when they trained on 4-engine bombers before going on their operational flying, they picked up a flight engineer and another gunner for a total of 7. I should say that unlike the American Air Force, there were no co-pilots in the Canadian and the British Air Force. There was only one pilot. If that pilot was wounded, was killed, otherwise incapacitated, there was nobody on board that plane who could fly it.
Interesting.
So, yes, that's how the crew formated. Yes, go ahead.
Well, what were you able to learn from talking with these other people about your uncle's personality? What was he like as a man and a human being?
That's the first question I always ask. And I always qualified by saying, don't tell me what you think I want to hear. Tell me the truth. Tell me what he was really like, warts and all. Feet of clay, if that's what it was. And they've agreed to do this. And I'm proud to say, I'm happy to say, although I would have written it any other way, is that he comes out looking very, very good. Those who knew him, his crew members and his friends in the Air Force and out of the Air Force, use one word constantly, as he was just a very nice, quiet, reserved guy. Not a hot shot, not a guy whose pilot status went to his head, but a guy who felt responsible for the rest of his crew. And if we have time, I'll read you a couple excerpts here from his own writing about how he felt this responsibility. Okay. But he was a soft-spoken guy, very popular with the ladies. You maybe tell from the photos and the paintings of him. A nice-looking chap, kind of. I think he could have been the poster boy for the RCAF during the war. He would have looked good on the recruiting poster.
Well, you said you actually met his girlfriend.
Yes, he had an English girlfriend. He went overseas single, I should say, and of course, over there all this time, you had all this male companionship. But of course, there were a lot of English ladies there who fancied these higher-paid gentlemen from the colonies, Canada and Australia and the rest. And so they struck up relationships. Many Canadians whom I know, flyers, even on his squadron, married English gals. He met a lady who was in Durham, not too far from his air base. And she was a delightful lady. I knew that she had worked and lived in Durham during the war. That's all I knew. I knew her maiden name, and that's all. Well, how do you find her? If she's still alive, you don't know. Well, I thought, you know, I'll write my quest, a little story about what I'm trying to do, and I'll send it to the Durham newspaper, just blind, give it to the editor there. Well, they printed it,
and sure enough,
she saw it. I found her, and we became very good friends. She died tragically in a car accident a few years ago, but fortunately, she told me many wonderful stories, true stories about what she tried to teach him to dance a little bit, but he was too shy and didn't want to. And the Canadians got together and got a hockey rink. You know, Canadians and hockey are inseparable. And so they flooded a rink in Durham, England, so they could go up during their leaves and play a little hockey. And he'd like to do that. On his leaves, he'd go up and strap on some skates. God knows where he got them. But he'd go up there and his Canadian air crew friends, and they'd go up and cut a few figures on the ice up there. But again, she said he was quiet, but just a nice guy. Not a hot shot, not a hot dog.
Why don't you take us now to some of the missions. How many missions did he fly totally over there?
He flew a total of 19, 3 of those with his 7-man Halifax crew. As I told you, when they formed their crew, they were a 5-man crew, and there was a graduation exercise at the end of this. This is called Operational Training Unit, and this was to give you an idea of the real thing before you got your own crew. I mean, you got your own aircraft and started flying over Germany. What they did was, this graduation exercise was loading up the bomb bay with leaflets, with propaganda leaflets, not bombs. And usually they gave you a French target. This was to test you over enemy-held territory to make sure your navigator knew how to do it, how to find the target. You're going to be flying through hostile skies, French skies in this case, not German. And find the target. You took a photo flash. They dropped some phosphorus-type bombs that illuminated the sky, and so you could actually take a photograph of where you dropped your bombs, or in this case, your leaflets. They did that, saw a little flak, weren't bothered by German night fighters, got back and got some applause on their photographs. It indicated they had dropped their leaflets on the right place. And then after that,
he was
the
into
real
the real thing.
Then they took a leave in London, and in August 1943, they were assigned to a frontline bomber squadron, number 429, which was based near the city of York, England, where all the Canadian squadrons were based, in a beautiful name called the Vale of York. It was kind of a flat land surrounded by rolling hills. If you've ever seen James Herriot's stories set in Yorkshire, that's where these bomber bases were located. These beautiful rolling hills, the brick fences, and just a beautiful country. But the hills were deadly. in fog and industrial smoke. It was too easy to fly into those hills, and so many guys were killed in training accidents. But commencing on August 2nd, 1943, Stanwyck did not take his own crew, but he went with an experienced crew, so he as the pilot could see what it was like over Germany. And what operation, what target does he draw by chance that night? Hamburg, which was being laid waste by Bomber Command and the American Air Force. The object was to burn that city to the ground to show Hitler that this is what you can expect. Quit the war now, Hitler, or we're going to burn you down city by city. That night, this kid's first trip over Germany with another crew, he's sitting in the right seat watching an experienced crew in a Wellington. They get into the most hellacious thunderstorm and icing storm conditions you ever could read about. Lightning was knocking planes out of the sky. They couldn't gain any altitude. They couldn't even see the target. They dropped their bombs over what they hoped was Hamburg and knew it wasn't, and then beat it back home to England. But this was terror incorporated that night because just the storm itself was knocking planes out of the sky.
Well, let's talk a minute about, just set the scene for what the Bomber Command was trying to accomplish at this point in the war, so that people kind of get a historical context here. It was more to kill the civilians and scare the population than a military exercise.
David, this is a very ticklish, touchy, and sensitive issue. The men who flew these missions were briefed beforehand that they had military targets to hit, and there were, in fact, these targets in every city. The flyers, as the people who designed these operations knew full well, that their bombs weren't all going to drop on those targets. They were going to hit civilian areas. They were going to bomb wide areas of the city, some of which were not involved in the war effort. That was just one of the evils of warfare itself. Latter day, a lot of revisionist historians have said that all the Allied air offensive was to kill civilian factory workers, to kill people, not to demolish war factories. Well, they knocked a lot of factories out of business, and they killed a lot of civilians too. The response to that is, we didn't start the war, we didn't want this in the first place. We had Bomber Command for the British and the Canadians, and our American Bomber Command were the only fighting units to take the war to Germany itself before D-Day. I mean, they were going over Germany and going right to Hitler's doorstep.
And there was a sense of morale building in that too.
Well, there was, but it was an all-out effort, and it became an obsession, and I use that word advisedly, by Bomber Harris, the man who, Sir Arthur Harris, who headed RAF Bomber Command. He had it in his mind. He was obsessed that if he bombed Berlin to flinders, to absolute ashes, Germany would quit the war. A lot of people, including Churchill, thought that was wrong, but they let Harris try it anyway. So what commenced in November of 1943, Dave, and it ended on the night my uncle was killed, March 24th, 1944, a series of all-out bomber mass raids on the city of Berlin. Harris was going to incinerate that town and be the hero and, in a sense, end the war. Well, it didn't work. Going into this so-called Battle of Berlin in November, he told his superiors in the Air Ministry, he said, it may cost us 500 aircraft, but it will cost Germany the war. He was right on the first part of that. It cost them 500 some aircraft, times 7 men in each plane.
And as this was going on and the losses mounted, then the idealism of youth began to fade into the realism of war.
You can read it in Stanwyck's letters. He mentions, as best that wartime censorship would allow him to, he mentions losing his friends. A couple of chaps that I trained with have gone missing. That was a euphemism for have been killed, or have been killed on operations. A dear friend of his who went through every training school with him, all the way, including England, and wound up on his same bomber base. A chap from Winnipeg named Sid Minter was killed, and that took a lot of spirit out of him. But he did say, he said, it sure is a shock, but here's one guy who's going to keep going where he left off. Sounds almost super patriotic, but the fact is, he resolved, like they all did, to see it through. But as the losses mount, he starts writing things like, I see Mussolini finally surrendered. As far as I'm concerned, the war can quit any time. There's another reference saying, I can't wait to get back into civilian clothes. So he had seen enough. He knew that his number probably was coming up, but he had the fingers crossed that he'd make it, but it was not to be.
Okay. Let's shift gears here for just a second. You've brought along some clothing and what have you from your uncle's experiences in the war here, and maybe you can describe what some of this is. This was taken. This is actual flight gear, I take it.
This is the actual flight gear. This tunic here was called a battle dress, and it was appropriately named. It was patterned after what the British Army had, but this is what the flyers wore. It's a heavy serge wool. They did not have goose down feathers and all the kinds of things that we have today. So they wore a heavy turtleneck sweater underneath, and then over this they would wear maybe a leather jacket, a sheepskin jacket. Over that, their Mae West flotation gear and their parachute harness. And you see the whistle. An interesting note there on the collar. They all were issued with this whistle. It was called a ditching whistle. If they were shot down in the English Channel or in the North Sea, if they did survive the cold water, if they did survive hypothermia and got into these little rafts that they carried in the wings of their aircraft, they would whistle for each other to band together. If somebody was in the water, they could hail each other and say, "I'm over here." The shrill whistle would be blowing. Or if they landed in land in the dark on land, they could find each other. So that was a necessary part of their survival gear. These boots here, actually, again, this is all actual gear. The boots were known as survival boots. They have the sheepskin tops, but they have what appear to be and what are essentially civilian shoes down below. If they were lucky enough to survive being shot down and land in their parachutes in enemy territory, and were further lucky to fall into the hands of the resistance, the underground, who would try to help them get out of the occupied territory and back to England, what they would do was, these were designed for this, they would rip away the upper part of this, and they would have what appear to be civilian shoes.
So they could go amongst the population.
They would go amongst the population, posing as laborers, workers, locals. And so that was what these were all about. And so they had all kinds of survival gear. This is the actual kind of helmet and goggles and oxygen mask that he and the other flyers wore. Why the goggles? It looks like kind of Waldo Pepper sort of thing from World War I. Well, a very practical reason, because if the windshield, the windscreen, the canopy got shot away in front of the pilot, mind you, there was only one pilot, not a co-pilot, then he would flip those down to protect his eyes from the howling wind, the rain, whatever else, and try to get the aircraft back home.
I see. Now, your uncle flew several missions as sort of a training flights. Tell me about the first actual flight that he had. It was a rather harrowing experience.
Well, that was the Hamburg one I told you about. That's the one where they ran into St. Elmo's fire, which is this lightning that was turns blue. The aircraft is lighted like a neon sign, and it's very dangerous. There's a terrific ice buildup on the wings. The aircraft couldn't gain altitude. They were falling out of the sky because the airflow was destroyed by the ice, and they didn't have these sophisticated de-icers that we have today. And so so it was a harrowing, it was literally a baptism of fire. He was an apprentice pilot. He was watching an experienced crew from inside that aircraft. I found 3 members of that particular aircraft that night, so they gave me first-hand accounts of that. That'll be in the book I write about him. By the way, all this research is going to culminate in a book, which is in progress now. He did another trip with another crew, this time in a Halifax, which we see behind the painting, the crew here in this painting, a 4-engine bomber. Looks a lot like a B-24 of the American Air Force in World War II. They went to Leverkusen, which was a city in the industrial heartland of Germany in the Ruhr. Very hot, huge amounts of searchlights, flak guns, and all the rest. And so he got another look at what it was like. After that, Dave, came September 29th, 1943. He takes his own crew, and they go on their first operational sortie into Bochum, the city of Bochum, again in the Ruhr Valley. Hot, hot, hot city. Very dangerous.
Tell me about that.
Interesting. Here they are, the first time they're going out on an operation, on a combat mission as a crew. They get out over the North Sea, and Stan, the pilot, always, as all good pilots did, had their gunners check their guns to make sure they were unjammed. There was a top gunner, and there was actually in this case not a top gunner because they had taken the turrets off. The commanding officer had ordered the top turrets to be removed.
Why
because
did
he
he
said
do that?
He thought they were useless. He said the German night fighter attacks came from below, not from above. This big bulky turret slows us down and we don't need it. So I'll have the top gunner just lie on his stomach and look through a perspex, little window in the floor of the aircraft, and warn the pilot to take evasive action. So they only had the tail gun. There were 4 303 guns in the tail. Well, Stanwyck asked his rear gunner, check your turret, make sure it's okay. He said, Skipper, I got bad news for you. The turret won't swing and the guns won't go up and down. There was a technical malfunction. So they had no defensive armament at all in this bomber. Had a German fighter come at them,
They were defenseless.
they were defenseless. So Stan Wick was a democratically minded guy. He said, I want to take a vote of you guys. What do you want to do? Do you want to turn back? Should we go back to base and tell them what the problem is? Or should we go on to the target? And they voted to a man, let's go on.
Well, there was a sense of duty about
Exactly.
going on. Turning back was seen as being a cowardly act.
Some commanding officers, including the commanding officer of my uncle's squadron, was death against turnbacks, early returns they were called, or boomerangs, coming back without having fulfilled your mission. So they went on, they bombed the target successfully, came back, and the commanding officer called my uncle aside afterward and said, you took an unnecessary risk. You put your crew at risk doing this. You shouldn't have done this. Don't ever do this again. The next mission was to Kassel, again in the Ruhr, the city of Kassel in the industrial heartland again. This time they take a different aircraft because the other one had a bad turret. So they get out over the North Sea and they can't gain altitude. My uncle and the flight engineer can't get enough boost in the engines to get up high enough so they're somewhat out of the range of the flak guns. My uncle, with the commanding officer's words still ringing in his ears saying, don't risk your crew unnecessarily, said, I'm turning back, and he did. He didn't take a vote that night. He said, we're going back. He lands the aircraft. The commanding officer, the same one, calls him in and said, why did you turn back? You shouldn't have done it. You should have gone on. All your engines were working. You should have gone.
How ironic.
So my uncle didn't know what to do. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. So what do? You just go on and take your chances. So
maybe you can give us a recount of what it was like actually to fly night missions. Now, he was flying night missions at this time?
The Royal Air Force Bomber Command, of which he was a part, flew night operations, right? The Americans flew by day. The British and the Commonwealth flyers flew by night. And so it was literally sometimes round-the-clock bombing.
Okay.
Yes.
So you must have gotten quite a description of what it was actually like to be in the cockpit and fly. Can you kind of walk us through, give us a picture of that?
There are many aspects to this, Dave, and I'll try to encapsulate it for you this way. Flying at night, unlike the Americans in day, the Americans flew in combat box formations, whereas they concentrated their aircraft in tightly packed formations so the gunners could concentrate their firepower on the German Luftwaffe. Obviously, the German fighters could see the American aircraft easily in daytime. The British, Canadians, Australians, all those flying in Bomber Command flew by night, and they flew not in box formations, but they flew almost in single file. They called it a bomber stream. They flew unescorted. There were no P-51s or Spitfires. They flew on their own because the cover of darkness they thought would give them some protection. But there was this tremendous, this hellacious danger of mid-air collisions, and many, many flyers were killed in mid-air collisions, taking off from their bases, forming up to go over the Channel or the North Sea, or coming back all shot up after a mission. So mid-air collisions was one. The weather, the winter of 1943-44, wouldn't you know, was one of the worst in European history in the 20th century. The weather, as on that Hamburg raid, but into the winter months on Berlin, was atrocious. A lot of aircraft, the Halifax aircraft especially, were underpowered as compared to the better four-engine Lancaster. Many aircraft were done in by the weather. They just couldn't cope with it. They iced and fell out of the sky into the North Sea, instant death. Then there were the German night fighters. There were legions, squadron after squadron of German night fighter aircraft whose sole mission was to shoot down and kill these guys flying in the bombers.
And the Germans also had some pretty advanced technology during that part of the war.
They had radar. They had the British had radar too, which they used to great effect in the Battle of Britain, and the Germans didn't know that. But the Germans smartened up pretty fast, and they hooked up radar to their flak guns. So once they could use computation to figure out, okay, they knew the bomber stream was coming. It should be over this point, and this was all calculated by their what are now probably very, outmoded kind of computers, but they worked with deadly efficiency. So once a flak gun got onto an aircraft, other flak guns would come onto it automatically. The searchlights would go on and get an aircraft in what they called a cone of searchlights and then blow it out of the sky. So there were the night fighters, the flak guns, the bad weather, the danger of mid-air collisions all the time, all of these factors.
And the precision of the bombing itself was less than...
It was there's no such thing as precision bombing by any Air Force in World War II. Even with the Americans' great Norden bomb site, hitting the proverbial fish in a barrel was not that easy. At night, it was even worse. That's why the British called it area night bombing, area being the operative word. They wanted to hit the target and lots of things around it too, and they did.
Do you have any recounts of how he was feeling, or any of the thoughts that were going through his mind during this period of?
Yes, I do. It's interesting, when he made his first flight on a Halifax, when he was just before he went on his operations. He said, "I feel quite proud today, just soloed on a nice big 4-engine bomber." He couldn't say what it was because of censorship. Not bad for a small town kid, eh? So even at this, on the cusp of going on operational flying, he was excited. There was a thrill to it. Again, he couldn't foresee at this point, this is before he went over Germany with these other crews, they were just about to do it. But as he goes through his flying, and it becomes more and more obvious that there are empty chairs and barracks rooms on his squadron. The guys he started flying with, the other crews, in September of '43, by March of '44, most of them were gone. They were killed. They were in the ground or in POW camps. His last leave, Dave, just before his death, before he came back to the squadron and flew that fatal Berlin run, he was on leave with his girlfriend in Durham, and she wrote that he became curiously quiet toward the end of his leave, that leave. There was a premonition. This sounds metaphysical, but it's true. He didn't talk about it too much, but she could tell that he felt that this might be the end of the line for him, that the losses were too great. He had just acquired a brand new, the latest model of Halifax bomber. It was equipped with big radial engines, which gave it more speed, more height, and he and the rest of the crew were pretty exhilarated about that. Here they were slogging through this winter, flying these horrible missions in an underpowered aircraft, but somehow getting through. They made it through, but now they had a better aircraft, and they figured to maybe cut the odds a little bit against their being killed or shot down. But that was probably the only bright, shining light that he had at this point. But I have a photo, I didn't bring it along, but there's a photo taken, as it turned out, about 3 weeks before he was killed. He's standing, kind of leaning against the door jamb of his barracks door, and he looks very old, he looks very tired. He's 21 years old, and maybe it was just one of those shots where you or I or anybody could be caught in a pose like that. But I think there's a lot of symbolism in that you could see that he knew something was coming.
Was there a sense of accomplishment of any sort amongst the pilots? All these horrible losses, the daily stress that they went through, were they sensing that what they were doing was making any difference at all?
That's a very, very good question, and I'm not so sure anybody can answer that. I think their sense of accomplishment was surviving another day. They led a very interesting dual life. Their bomber bases were situated by these quaint, picturesque villages, these English villages. The bomber bases, in the case of my uncle, Leeming was the name of the base. It took its name from the village, and it was cheek by jowl by the village. The villagers became part of the operation. And so they'd have this almost serene, countrified life 1 minute, and the next minute they're flying into Dante's Inferno, back and forth. Their accomplishment, I think, was survival. There was no way they could gauge how much damage overall the big picture was. They knew they were doing a lot of damage.
Well, did they even know? Were they even informed of what their little piece of the war was?
Their little piece of the war is all they got to know. And when they came back from an operation, they had their bombing photos developed. They had carried cameras in their bombers to make sure that, so the CO could see that they were not cheating and dumping their bombs in the North Sea and then hightailing it back. So, yeah, they could see that they hit the target. Was it satisfying? I don't think so. The ones I talk with, the surviving aircrew, are not the gung-ho warrior types at all. They were very ordinary guys. Many of them headed for college. Many of them didn't really know, but just to a quiet civilian life. And then the war came. And they weren't in it. They weren't professional military men. I think they just simply wanted to survive day to day. These were volunteers, Dave. All of these aircrew volunteered for this. If they didn't, they were probably going to be drafted into the Army or the Navy. But there was this lure, this lure and the excitement of flying. But you were in it for keeps. He had to do 30 operations, 30 successful operations over Germany before he had finished what they call a tour of duty. The Americans had 25 to do early in the war because flying in daylight was was a slaughter too. Well, he made it to 19, and a couple of those were disallowed because he had to turn back on that one occasion, got no credit for that, and another one he had to come back early because of a legitimate technical problem. So they were just about halfway through their tour, and so it was difficult. They couldn't quit because you would be branded lack of moral fiber, what they call LMF. That was spineless, yellow, coward, and they would not quit. Very few aircrew quit, who just said, I can't take it anymore. And if they were lined up in front of the squadron and they literally had the chevrons or the stripes or their officers' stripes torn off them. They were disgraced in front of their men, and they were sent off to clean toilets. They were disgraced. Every man has his breaking
Shunned,
point.
I imagine.
And I have talked to the survivors, and they said this was ridiculous. This was so unfair to these men. I had to stand, he said, one of them told me, I had to stand and watch one of these men, a guy I knew, not in my crew, but a guy I knew, a gunner who just dropped, just as they were queued up to take off one night, he rotated his turret, opened the back door, and just got out and walked away in front of all these bombers. That took courage, he said. That took courage to quit in front of everybody else, but very few took that course. Let's face it, some of these guys just broke. Everybody has his breaking point.
Yes.
But it's remarkable how many stayed in right to the bitter end.
Well, what have you been able to learn about the last bombing mission that he flew?
A lot. I've been able to that's the raid I want to reconstruct in the greatest detail of all. This was what came to be the last of the major bombing raids against Berlin, because by this point in the war, March 1944, Eisenhower was in charge of the D-Day preparations, and they wanted, for that reason, to turn the air forces, all the Allied air forces, on French targets. Bomber Harris of the RAF said, I want one more shot at Berlin. He still held out. I still can wreck Berlin. If you let me wreck Berlin, we'll end the war. Everybody knew that wasn't going to happen. But Harris had his way. He got one more mass raid to Berlin. It was Friday morning, March 24th, 1944. Incidentally, there's a story in the news right now that happened on that very same day. Erich Priebke, an SS commander, is on trial in Italy right now for the massacre of Italian civilians in these caves south of Rome, a reprisal killing for Italian partisans killing some German soldiers. That happened the morning of this day.
Interesting.
Also, in a prisoner of war camp outside of Berlin this very same day, there were 3 tunnels being dug by Allied airmen, most of them British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealanders, who were set to break out of Stalag Luft 3. This became a movie called The Great Escape, James Garner. This was in progress that same day too, and they broke out the very night. So interesting things happening coincidentally.
A lot of history
to this.
involved in that day.
It looked that morning they wouldn't have an air raid that night because the British sent up a Mosquito, a fast-moving weather plane. It flew over Berlin, and the weather conditions looked bad. He flew back and reported this. Harris said, send up another plane, send up another weather plane in the afternoon. They did, came back, things had improved a little bit. He said, we're going. So all of these squadrons throughout Bomber Command were notified, it's Berlin tonight. They called it the Big City. That was known to the aircrew as the Big City. More flak guns, more night fighters, more everything bad. And so they had their briefing at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Takeoff time was set for around 7 in the evening, and all of these aircraft thundered off. 811 4-engine bombers took off from England for Berlin that night. And unbeknownst to the meteorologists at the briefing and during the raid, there was something called the jet stream. We call the jet stream today. We know about it. This is a fast-moving current of air, river of air, about 21,000 feet. Well, the flyers and the planners didn't know about that phenomenon, but it was in force that night. It blew the aircraft south of their allotted track. Now we can show you the track the aircraft took that night on this map. You can see the northernmost line, the top line on your screen there, shows the journey across the North Sea from England over Denmark, and you can see a lot of X's and diamond shape. Now what those X's and diamonds mean are aircraft, our aircraft, falling to night fighters, most of all to flak guns, because they were blowing off course over the flak guns. The German flak gunners that night had a field day because these aircraft were coming right over them. And the navigators didn't know that they were being blown off their track.
How were you able to get this map reconstructed?
From navigators who flew that mission, from his own squadron. Some of them kept their navigational charts. And this particular one was put together by RAF Bomber Command a couple weeks after the raid, when they had determined where the aircraft fell and to whom. German fighters or to flak guns. And near Magdeburg, just southwest of Berlin, you can see one of those crosses, or X's, or crosses is probably more appropriate, is one of my uncle's aircraft. And the one next to it's another aircraft from the same squadron, both shot down. There were 3 aircraft from his squadron that were lost that night. All 3 pilots were killed, and many of the crewmen were too. A total of 72 aircraft, command-wide, were lost that night. The British lost. When I say British, I mean all the Canadians and all. 72 4-engine bombers went down that night.
Nearly 10%
and he was
of the
one of them.
flight,
Yeah. And my uncle's aircraft was bracketed by flak. The gunners, again, they were blowing south of track, didn't know it, right over these flak guns, and bang, bang, bang. The mid-upper gunner did have a turret on this trip because they kept their gun turrets on these later model Halifaxes, but Stanwyck told his mid-upper gunner that night, "Bob, lie down on the floor and watch from below, and call out any aircraft you might see coming up at us or any flak gun bursts coming at us. Let me know." If Bob had not been lying on his stomach looking down below, he would have died instantly because one of the flak bursts set his turret on fire in the whole middle part of the aircraft. And so Bob jumped out after my uncle said, "Boys, I think we've had it. Let's get out of here. We can't put this fire out." And Bob jumped out, tore off his helmet like that one, and his hair was burning, singeing on the back of his neck when he jumped. Up front, the navigator dropped out to his safety, and so did the radio operator. And all of these three men have become my friends. They got out just in time, and they opened their parachutes, and just at that instant, the aircraft with the four others inside blew up. And that was the end.
Were they ever able to recover the body
Yes.
or find the plane?
They did. I have the German records that indicate where they found the bodies, where they found the wreckage, and it was scattered over a 1 mile area. It would be what became East Germany under the Soviet zone.
Have you been able to go actually
No,
see
but I
that
want to
place?
now that there's no longer a Soviet zone,
Yeah.
East Germany, I can get there. I know exactly a little village. They were found there and buried in a churchyard. The Germans erected crosses, say, "Here lies," in German, of course, "Here lies the body of a crashed English lieutenant." That was my uncle. The bodies were badly burned. There was, I have the exhumation. 1947, the British Commonwealth War Graves Commission sent people out across Germany to disinter these Allied airmen and rebury them in cemeteries, formal cemeteries. I have the exhumation reports of what they found when they opened these graves. And some of the whistle, for example, was still there. The pilot's wings were still, and even the blonde wavy hair was still visible. But not
Were
much
the
else.
others captured?
The others were captured. One of them burrowed into a haystack and spent the night there, but a farmer saw him and alerted the local gendarmes or the local Wehrmacht, and they came out and got them. They all were captured the next morning, all three of them, and they were packed off to a prisoner of war camp.
Now, you indicated earlier that this crew had stayed together for quite a period of time.
Yes.
After you saw them, after these many years, what emotions went through them that night?
At first, there was the shock of bailing out, of landing in German territory. I think most of the crew thought they'd survive their tour, they'd get through, they'd gotten so far, they had this new aircraft. But once they got over the initial shock, and it was a shock of bailing out from 21,000 feet, bitter cold, risking life and limb landing who knows where, on high power lines or in a pond or a river, that was just dicey enough. But after the shock wore off, they wanted to know, what about the other four? Where are the other four? Well, the Germans, after they had all three of them in a jail, brought in the identification tags of their comrades. But their escape training had told them, don't believe them. They're going to tell you the other guys were killed, but don't believe them. So they didn't know for a long time. When they did find out, to this day, it's a very, very painful thing. They were very close. They had to function as a team. And one quick anecdote, because I know we're running out of time here. 3 years ago, I was at Leaming, Yorkshire, for a dedication of a memorial to the fellows who didn't come back. And the radio operator, Stan Bowstead, part of my uncle's crew, was with me. We were looking through a photo album, and I showed him some photos of my uncle that were taken during that time. He had never seen them before. We're sitting in this beautiful coffee shop, the sun's coming in the window, and he looks at them, and suddenly he grabs his napkin and looks away, and he's weeping. And he's an Englishman, the typical reserved Englishman, doesn't show much emotion, but he apologized to me for showing emotion. I said, I think it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, But that's to answer your question, that's how they feel. Yeah.
How or what things have you learned in this very long journey? You certainly have amassed a lot of facts and information about your Uncle Stan and the people that he fought with, lived and died with. Have you gotten anything more out of this in terms of a big picture of life or anything else that you want to share?
All of that. You learn, of course, and it sounds like a cliche, but David, it's true, the futility, the stupidity of war, the waste. I've walked through the cemeteries, and you can say this about the Germans and everybody else. Most of them were not gung-ho patriots. They got sucked into this meat grinder, and so many of them paid the price. You find out what good people they were, how dedicated they were, how they found, these were, I guess again another cliche, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. You don't find out what you can do until you're put on the hot griddle and have to do it.
Yeah.
The goodness of these people, and to this day the survivors go out of their way to help me, because it's not for me, it's for a comrade. The might have been, the what ifs, you always wonder about what might these people have become in their life. You know, you look at a grave of a flyer, maybe that was the doctor who would become a doctor to cure cancer, or all this great talent. Most of these chaps were a cut above, because you had to be to make the grade here, you know. But I think just the sadness of, and you see the war in Bosnia, the atrocities, what's going on in Asia and the rest, and say, when are we ever going to learn? We don't seem to learn.
Well, Stan, thank you very much for a personal, insightful look at one individual's war. Many, many facts and pieces of information came out of this that certainly shed a lot of light on what it was actually like to go through this experience. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come here and visit with us today and tell us about your Uncle Stan. Best of luck with your book, too. Do you have any idea about when that might be available? Do you have a title for it and working?
Everybody asks me about a title, and you know, I think about that every day, and it hasn't hit me yet, and I'm not worried. I know it's going to come. It may be, you find it like Hemingway used to look through the Bible, and I've looked everywhere, on the back of cereal boxes. Something is going to click. Yeah, the publishers, the prospective publishers, want to make sure that the story is heavy on the combat action, not so heavy on what he was like. I'm trying to have it both ways, because you've got to know the person to know the story, the full story.
Absolutely.
And you have given me, and Meredith has, thank you very much for this opportunity to focus on an individual. We so often talk about fighting units and these big segments of the war, but there are very few shows, if any, like yours that really key on one person who's not a so-called big name in the war. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, again, thank you very much for this
My
personal
pleasure.
glimpse. And thank you very much for tuning in to see another edition of World War II, The Personal Stories. We'd like to invite any of you who have stories about World War II, either personal or such as Stan, information about a relative that would be of interest to us, to please contact us at the show, and we'd be more than happy to talk to you about your personal experiences. So once again, until the next edition of World War II, Personal Stories, this is Dave Smith. Thank you very much for watching.